Okay, in this video here we are going to measure up a steam distributing coil with our dimensional sheet. I'm Dave with Commercial Coils and we'll get you started. First area we're going to start up is the right hand corner of our sheet, determining the tube and its material. On this coil here you can see that it has like a copper look to it along with the header here. You can take a knife or something just to kind of scrape on it to make sure that you see copper, and on this particular coil it is copper. So we're going to circle copper. Now we do offer other materials. If you want to choose a different material, you would just need to tell us and then we'll try and get you that quote for that material. Next item up is the tube diameter. To determine the tube diameter, you can look at it sometimes and even kind of just look at it and tell. Try and use your tape measure, and try and measure it up as best that you can by looking at it. The other device that we have is this little item here. Got the little cutouts indicating the tube diameters that you can choose from. And obviously if I try to put the 5/8 here on this one, it doesn't quite fit. So I'm going to go to the other side with the 1 inch because I think that's what we have, and sure enough it fits on there real nice. So this coil has a 1 inch diameter tube. So we'll circle the 1 inch. Our sheet will show 1 1/8, but you'll still want to just indicate that as a 1 inch tube. Underneath there you'll see the thicknesses. You're not going to be able to cut the coil open and look at the thicknesses, so it'll be your preference of what you think you want that particular thickness to be. The next item up is our fins and its material. On this coil here, the fins move pretty easy and they've got the aluminum look to them, so I know that this particular coil here has aluminum fins. Now if you know it has a different fin material and you need it to be a different fin material, please just indicate it so on the drawing or just write it in. Now we can also do copper, so if you have a fin that is copper, you would circle copper. This guy here is aluminum, so we'll circle aluminum. And also underneath their fins you'll see the 1 1/8 again, which we have an 1 1/8 tube, so that's what the fins need to be. And again, as far as the thickness of the fin, it's going to be your preference because not many of you are probably going to have a gauge to be able to measure that, so you'll just indicate it as such of what you want it to be. First item up in our dimensional area is asking for quantity. I just need 1 coil here, so I'm going to indicate 1. Next item up are the number of tubes high. So what we'll do there is what we're asking for is just how many tubes does the coil have from the very top to the bottom. And this coil here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so I'm going to indicate 5. Next question is, how many row of tubes does the coil have? In this particular coil, it just has 1 row. So if I had like another tube over here, I would have a 2-row coil. In this particular case, this one just has 1. So I'm going to put 1 in the rows. Next item up is the fins per inch. The fins per inch, we're just going to put a tape measure across there and count the number of fins that we have within 1 inch. And on this coil here, we have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So this coil has 14 fins per inch. Next item up is our A dimension, which is also known as our fin height dimension. Again, it's going to be from the very top to the very bottom, and we're going to measure that for our A dimension. And on this coil here, we have 15 inches. So that's our A dimension. Next up is our B dimension, which is our fin length. Fin length is just going to be from fin here to the fins here, giving us our fin length, which is our B dimension. And on this coil here, we have 18 inches. So B is 18. Now this is a steam distributing coil that actually has a pitched casing. What that means is that the tubes are pitched within the casing to allow condensate to roll back to the main header. So you can see the casing is thicker here and gets thinner here. So the first dimension that we're going to come and measure here is our HI dimension. So on this coil here, we are measuring 1 3/4. So that's our HI dimension. Next up is our LO dimension, which is the lower thickness. So we're going to measure that. So on this particular coil, we are going to measure, it comes up with 1 1/4 inches. So we'll put that in for LO, 1 1/4 inches. The next item up is D and E. On our drawing sheet, D is this casing dimension, E is this casing dimension. So we'll measure first up D, and on this coil here, we have 1.5 inches. So D is 1.5 inches. Next is E, and on this coil here, it is 1.5 inches. So E is 1.5 inches. Next up is our F dimension. F dimension is going to be from the very top of the casing to the very bottom of the casing. So we'll measure that. And on this coil, it is 18 inches. F is 18. Next up is our G dimension. G dimension is going to be from the very end of the casing to the very front of the casing. So we'll measure that here to there. And on this coil, it is 21 inches. Now the way to double check your G dimension is you could take D plus B plus E, and then that will give you G. Next up is our H dimension. H dimension is just basically how wide our casing is from edge to edge, and we'll measure that. And on this coil here, we have 5 inches. So that's our H dimension. Next up is our I dimension. The I dimension is going to be from the very back edge of this, whether it's the casing dimension or it's how far out the back tube sticks. On this particular coil, it's a steam distributing coil, so it doesn't have return bends. It's got a little plug. So in this particular case, my casing dimension is actually sticking out further than my tube. So on this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure from this edge all the way down to the other end to get my I dimension. And the reason for these are plugged is because there's a tube within a tube. The inner tube is going to bring the steam in. It will condense into the outer tube, bringing it back to the main header. Now my I dimension is going to be from the, like I said before, the very back edge to the very front edge of our header. So we're going to measure that. It gives ourselves a little straight edge to work with. And on this coil here, it measures out to be 24.5 inches. So that is our I dimension. Next is our J dimension. J dimension is asking for is the very end of this connection to the face of the header. We'll measure that. On this coil here, it is measuring 2 7/8. That's our J dimension. Next is our L dimension. The L dimension is going to be from the casing face to the end of the header. So we'll measure that. And on this coil here, it measures 5 inches. So that is our L dimension. Now, if you wanted to double check your I dimension, what you could do at this point is you could take D plus B plus L should give you I. Next item up is going to be our S dimension. The S dimension is going to be from the very bottom of the casing to the center of this connection. So what we're going to do, we're going to measure from the very bottom. Since this is sitting on this flat, we're going to measure just from here right to the center of this connection. And on this coil here, I'm getting 8 3/4. So S is 8 3/4. Next item up is the R dimension. R, again, is going to be from the bottom of the casing to the center of our connection. And sometimes I will use a straight edge so that I can measure. So we'll take that, measure that. And then on this coil here, we get 2 3/4. So that's our R dimension. Next is our X dimension. X dimension is going to be measured from the edge of the casing to the center of your header. So we'll go ahead and measure that, and you're going to want to measure on both sides to make sure that you get it. If this is off to the center, you'll get 2 different dimensions. So we'll measure that on this coil. And on this one here, it's 2.5 from that edge. Using my straight edge again. And it measures again 2.5 inches. So our X dimension is going to measure 2.5 inches, which then puts it right in the middle of our H dimension of 5 inches. Next item up is the H diameter, which is the header diameter. So we'll measure that. And on this coil here, it measures 3 1/8. So 3 1/8 for the HD diameter. Next up is to determine what our connection sizes are. And what we can do is we'll measure the outer diameter of this connection. Or you may already know what it is because you already have piped up to it. And on this coil here, it measures about 2 1/8 to 2 3/16. And I say about because on those connections, you can look it up on a chart and then determine what the proper size is. But in this particular case here, since this is about 2 1/8, I can look up on my little chart here, and then I can find out that this coil is going to use an 1.5 inch connection. So I will indicate 1.5 inches. And we'll double check this one too, make sure it's the same. It looks like it is. And it's about, like I said, about 2 1/8, 2 3/16. So that too will make us use a 1.5 inch connection. Next item up is to determine what type of end fitting is needed. On this coil here, the outside edge is using MPT because the threads are on the outside. So on this coil, I will indicate that it needs MPT. If the threads were on the inside, it'd be FPT. And if you don't have any threads at all, then you would just indicate a sweat fitting. Now, if you have a different fitting altogether, just indicate it on our sheet, and we'll see if we can provide that fitting for you. Now that completes our dimensional sheet. And then at any time, if you have any other thoughts or questions, please feel free to contact Commercial Coils, and we'll get you what you need.